Look at the 28th verse. This is what Jesus said. Assuredly, Jesus is speaking, Gospel by Mark, chapter 3, verse 28. Assuredly, I say to you, all sin will be forgiven the sons of men. Jesus declares in one sentence that all sins are forgivable. Now think about that, because we have that nemesis out there everyone asks about. In fact, whenever I meet college campuses and I do retreats, just did one in January, had about 500 students from a bunch of Arkansas and Oklahoma universities and Missouri, some. They all came in and they get to ask any question they want. And we do this session Q&A time, and they can ask anything they want about the Bible, not about sports. I don't know about sports. I plan to neglect that. I know nothing about sports and very little about many other things, but they can ask me Bible questions. And so one of the questions that always comes up in every group is, they hem-haw around and they think they've committed the what? Unpardonable sin. And what's interesting is the unpardonable sin is right the next verse. Did you notice that's in verse 29? But he who blasphemes against the Holy Spirit never has forgiveness, but subject to eternal condemnation, because they said he has an unclean spirit. See, he was saying this in the context of the unpardonable sin. And so what they wonder is, have they committed it? But what Jesus said is, all sins are forgivable. What's the unpardonable sin? It was what they were doing right there. They had Jesus Christ right in front of them, and they were looking at Him, and He was offering them the miracle of complete forgiveness, and they were rejecting Him, the one who could give that. If you want to simplify it, you can commit the unpardonable sin by never receiving Christ's forgiveness. That is the ultimate unpardonable sin. Now, technically, in theological terms, it was the denying of the supernatural, the deity and power of Jesus Christ as it was unfolded before them, and they refused to accept that, and Jesus told them that was never forgivable. But that unpardonable sin still goes on today. People reject Jesus Christ. They don't deny the Holy Spirit working through Him in bodily form, but they deny His saving grace. But let me talk to you about the greatest miracle. As Jesus lived and walked on earth for 30 plus years, it must have been the greatest joy to have seen Him. In fact, Peter shows that in this 16 chapter eyewitness account as he talks about what it was like. I mean, even when Peter describes the feeding of the 5,000, he doesn't just say Jesus did it. He describes, and the Greek words he used is, it was like little flower beds, multicolored, as the people sat in little groupings. And he uses the Greek word for clusters of flowers, as he remembers on his mind this picture of the little clumps of people that were all sitting there hungrily, and Jesus began to break the bread, and it just multiplied in the loaves. And Peter remembers his basket just filling up, and he just saw Jesus just going like this, and I don't know how it did it. If each loaf got long, or if he put one and they multiplied in the basket. I don't know how it happened, but I know it happened. And Peter just was riveted. But Peter's remembering that event. But when you think about all the miracles Christ did, and Peter records many of them in this gospel, and the other gospel writers do too, which one was the greatest? Well, think of some of the miracles. The paralyzed, the lame, the mute, and the blind that Jesus gave back their eyes, their fingers, their toes, and their skin, eventually lost all those again. Did you ever think of it? The blind man finally got old and probably got blind again when he was in later years. The deaf that got their hearing back, most people know your hearing kind of declines the older you get. The lepers who got fresh baby-like skin, as adults they had that baby-like skin. It got old and rough and worn by the time they died. It all went away. The food that was miraculously created by Jesus was consumed by the 5,000 and the 4,000. It was used up, and their hunger returned probably later that day or the next day. That was a great miracle, but it ended. The eyes that were restored to blind Bartimaeus were used and worn out and dim by the time he died. Remember, he was hopping around. He was so excited, blind Bartimaeus, couldn't stop telling everybody he could see. Those eyes wore out again. That miracle was wonderful, but it was just momentary, and it went away. The hearing that the deaf received were subject to the natural downward slide of the human body and faded most likely before their death. The dancing feet after Christ's touch that the lame possessed soon turned to a shuffle and then stopped walking altogether as they lay in bed awaiting death many years later. But one of Christ's miracles never faded, never ended, never diminished, never went away. And that's the one I call the greatest. And it wasn't Lazarus being raised back to life, because guess what? That's probably why Jesus wept. Because he knew that Lazarus had to go through it again, had to die a second time after dying the first time. The greatest miracle is the one that never goes away. The one that never faded, the miracle that never aged, the miracle that never ended. It was the miracle untouched by health, unaffected by circumstances. It was the miracle that was the greatest. And that's what is right here in chapter 3 and verse 28. It's the miracle of complete forgiveness.